thanks very much. And it's really interesting to be here at a meeting where people really do understand the complexities of obesities and the complexities of management and treatment. So what I'll talk about in the graveyard shift is behavioural approaches to longer term weight management and where we've been in research in the last few years and how that fits in to the overall picture of obesity treatment. And I'm sure you're all aware that the diet, lifestyle, physical activity, behavioural approaches are meant to be the first line at the maximum level of scale that we manage to invoke in helping people manage their weight. If I can just click this on. And this presentation is really coming almost exclusively from the perspective of research into behaviour change interventions and where we're at, what perhaps we've achieved, what perhaps we have not achieved, what perhaps we are missing, and where we can go. So we're looking at behaviour change interventions for longer term weight management. So really the substance of this presentation is not about pharmacological or surgical interventions, important as they are. We want to talk a little bit about the dynamic relationship between weight loss and weight loss maintenance, because there is a discussion and a debate in the behaviour change field as to the extent to which these are one or two separate processes. And I'd like to bring to your attention what we think is the importance of energy balance, physiology, and behaviour, and the importance of trying to better measure that stuff. Because behaviour change interventions are trying to target energy balance behaviours. But what if we cannot measure those things anywhere near as well as we think we can? And what are the consequences for outcomes? And that leads to perhaps a discussion of, can we improve outcomes by linking the mechanisms of action of those behaviour change interventions to better measurements of energy balance behaviours in relation to the behaviours we believe we're trying to impact. And we're hoping to elicit some debate and some feedback from practitioners, because we're coming at this almost exclusively from a research perspective. And we've kind of drafted a position statement on this, and we've circulated it to some people, and we're very grateful to those who have given us some feedback, and we will recirculate it to a wider group of people and elicit more feedback. So if we ask how much weight is lost, I'm sure you're all aware of this. In behaviour change interventions, we actually don't... Oh, hang on. Put that back. Where's the pointy thing? There it is. We don't see that much compared to drugs or surgery. And someone said to me, come on, James, this is a 15-year-old slide. Here's one which is less old. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis of multi-component behavioural weight management programs delivered by therapists in routine practice. And the outcomes are pretty much the same as summarised by the previous slide, in that we tend to see very little at 12 months that exceeds 5% on a group basis. At 24 months, nothing more happens, and usually rather less. And this is weight loss interventions using behaviour change approaches. If we look at weight loss maintenance interventions, the outcomes on a mean basis, if you look at the mean of means, right down here, about 1.5 kilograms. And the interesting thing I think to point out is in these interventions, on average, people tend to lose about 10% of their weight. They're losing 10 to 12 kilograms. So at the end of a behaviour-only intervention, we're giving them back about 15% of what they lost, and they're regaining 85 or so % of what they originally lost. And do we consider that to be a success? And we've recently, in the last 10 years, had a number of quite high-profile behaviour-focused interventions for the purpose of the maintenance of weight that's lost. And the argument goes, well, actually, it's not that hard to get people to lose weight. The real difficulty is helping them prevent weight regain. And I don't think anyone in this room will argue too strongly against that. So here's a snapshot of a few of those really big trials. This is the weight loss maintenance randomized control trial in the US, where they compared self-directed interactive technology or personal contact. And at the end of this trial, at 30 months, the difference in outcomes is about 1.2 kilograms. This is the now very famous Diogenes intervention using dietary approaches to weight management in weight loss that was induced by very low calorie diets. And at the end of 6 months in this particular intervention, the maximum effect did not exceed, on a group basis, i.e. trial arm basis, 2 kilograms. And again, these people lost about 11 kilograms during the weight loss phase. This is the recent New Level trial led by Falco Sniotta at the University of Newcastle, using light touch self-regulatory approaches delivered digitally for weight loss maintenance. And it's a remarkable lack of difference between the intervention and control arms. And these are the results of the recent NoHoW trial that we've been working for the last 4.5 years on. And these are not the main effect results. The main effect results don't look anything as good as this. The main effect results are no result, just like in New Level. This is a subgroup analysis to show the biggest effect, if you like, you can pull out of the data if you look at men who are completers. And the effect size is about 1.5 kilogram in a subgroup of a subgroup. And I don't think anybody will argue too strongly if I say in non-surgical interventions for weight loss, obesity or obesities could be considered to respond to those interventions as a chronic relapsing condition. Typically, maximum weight loss is achieved at about 6 months, and then weight gradually creeps back up. And the interesting thing about nearly all these interventions is you configure your intervention, you decide what the active ingredients are going to be, you set up your logic models, and you let it run. There's no reconfiguration of the intervention, there's no re-intensification, you just let it run constantly. And when you do that, this is what you see. So this seems to be the typical response to setting up a constant intervention of a constant content and a constant approach. And I think there's a considerable debate at the present time as to whether behaviourally the same behaviours responsible for weight loss are the same behaviours and skill sets that people use for weight loss maintenance, or whether there's a different skill set. And there has been a tendency to split the behavioural side of research into weight management into loss and maintenance. And there are indeed theories and models for behaviour change and maintenance of behaviour change. But I think in this scenario, this is what weight loss and maintenance look like. There's a dynamic interaction where people who initially lose weight engage in dietary activity self-management behaviours, and some of them are extremely successful, straight through to maintenance. Most are not, and most struggle at some point, as we've heard throughout the last couple of days. And they struggle with goals, relapse issues, emotion regulation, as we've only just heard, stress management. And that leads to a situation where they revisit the behaviours and the skills they developed in initial weight loss. And we even know that for those who go straight through to this situation, National Weight Control Registry, 25% frequently lapse, and 25% struggle hard to get back on track. And people who are trying to maintain use the mistakes and the techniques that they initially gathered. So it's a cyclical, dynamic interaction. And I think it's probably worth pausing, and this is from a behavioural perspective, to ask the question, what actually is weight loss maintenance? And you can say, no, it's 10%, it's 5%, no, it's 3%. But if you look at it behaviourally, there is this issue of whether maintenance requires a different skill set to loss, or it's just simply a continuation of those skill sets. It's almost certainly a blend of the two. It's quite heterogeneous, it's quite dynamic. If you ask people themselves what weight loss maintenance is, it's their own goals. So what is, if you want to behaviourally define a group of weight loss maintainers, the cleanest definition is the National Weight Control Registry, a group of people who have achieved a significant amount of weight loss, and they are at their goal trying to stay there. Because many people who engage in weight loss maintenance interventions are actually still trying to lose more weight. So this is the cleanest definition behaviourally that you can find. Physiologically, we've heard some of this in the last presentation and a number of presentations today. Physiologically, there's a lot of stuff going on under the surface. Remember I said we set up these interventions, many of them are behavioural, and we let them run like a ship going across the waves. But there is stuff under those waves which might be pulling back on the ship, and we'll look at that in a moment. Because it's becoming increasingly clear, and we just heard about the Greatest Loser example, but there are a number of other examples, such as the calorie studies, such as underfeeding studies, where changes in energy expenditure, changes in appetite, and compensatory changes in energy intake undermine behaviour change interventions that we set up and let run. And many of the models that we use for the delivery of behaviour change interventions do not speak to those compensatory changes in physiology and behaviour. In many senses, they're almost blind to them. And there's a very clever psychologist called Colin Greaves who's articulated this as a dynamic or a tension for people trying to maintain weight loss. It's an ongoing struggle, even for successful maintainers, that may ameliorate with time. So the first position that we have taken in this dialogue or this debate, it's not the original one that we had, Dominika, is that weight loss can be described as a period of loss and subsequent maintenance, but the actual process is more dynamic and usually follows a trajectory of loss followed by regain. And in the position, we're suggesting that weight change programs should take account of that dynamism and design themselves accordingly. So if we then look at the psychological and behavioural predictors of weight loss maintenance, this is the most recent large-scale systematic review by Varkowitz et al. And what they find is social and environmental factors do not predict anything. And that's probably because there's just not enough data there at the present time. More robustly, they find good evidence that baseline predictors don't predict much. And that's a pretty common finding in the area of behaviour and weight outcomes. Centrally, they tend to find that it is energy balance behaviours, the regulation or self-regulation of eating, physical activity behaviours, management of problematic eating behaviours, as we've just heard, that are central predictors of change over time. And that those behaviours have clustered around them certain mechanisms relating in this articulation to self-efficacy, self-management, self-regulation. And in terms of the field of behavior science, the way this is articulated is that we try and understand complex interventions for behavior change in terms of what we call their mechanisms of action. And there is a large attempt to take those complex diet, physical activity, self-management approaches and break them down into all their active components and describe them as behavior change techniques. And those behavior change techniques are believed to be the mechanisms by which behavior is changed in this case, weight management interventions. And there are a lot of them. And they are supposed to be informed by psychological theory and a theoretical domains framework. In fact, there are now several of these taxonomies of behavior change techniques. And interestingly, the idea is they map behavior change techniques onto mechanisms of change to identify the active ingredients by which these interventions will deliver their effect. Interestingly, they operate mostly at the level of cognitive behavior change, cognitive awareness, often self-reported. Here's another example, another meta-analysis showing just this, that self-regulatory factors for weight outcomes themselves, for physical activity and dietary intake can be detected. Usually the effect sizes are modest, the relationships are fairly tenuous. And the interesting thing in all of these models is that the active ingredients are self-reported, as are the outcomes. And we'll come on to that in a moment. So in this particular analysis, by very rigorous analysis by Teixeira et al., physical activity is not directly measured. It's self-reported in 80% of studies. For dietary intake, self-reported in 100% of studies. And hence, you might not be completely surprised to hear that there is no consistent mediators of self-report dietary intake. Why? Because we know self-report dietary intake produces big errors. That's the behavioural side. I talked about the ship on the water. Under the surface, we know that weight loss, a negative energy balance, has and the configuration of that negative energy balance, rate, amount, the composition of the body when the energy balance begins, has a profound effect on longitudinal changes in body composition. And those changes in body composition, and we've heard this throughout the course of this meeting, have a profound effect on physiological function. And those changes in physiological function, as we heard in the last presentation, impact on appetite signals, reward systems, energy expenditure and its components, both physiological components of energy expenditure and behavioral components of energy expenditure, which affect behavior. And those behaviors oppose the initial change that we're trying to achieve. This is the system responding to energy deficits. And the interesting thing is if we can put, as some people, like the NIH guys, the Kevin Hall guys, the guys at the Pennington, Diana Thomas, started using mathematical models to try and quantify those behaviors, because we need models to do it because we can't measure them by self-report. 75% of those behaviors seem to be energy intake. 25% of them seem to be energy expenditure. I would speculate, hypothesize to you that 80% of all of those behaviors are outside of conscious awareness. Now, that is a real problem if we're asking people to self-manage their own behaviors. How can you self-manage something that is outside your conscious awareness? Why should we blame people for relapsing when they cannot be aware of it and we cannot measure it? Here's an example of how those models work. On this side is used, and I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute, but this is a reanalysis of the Heshka study, a diet, lifestyle, behavior program for weight management by Polidori et al. In 2016. And what it really shows is that during a intervention which follows a typical pattern for a dietary approach to weight management, that energy intake exponentially relaxes as the intervention proceeds. So initially, at the beginning, people are constraining their energy intake by 600 calories a day. Then it gradually relaxes. And it seems that people are unaware this is happening. We've just done a similar reanalysis of the NoHoW cohort, 1,600 people. And the people who lose the most weight in the intervention show the greatest relaxation of energy intake as the study progresses over 18 months. We think all of this is outside of conscious awareness. So what I've been talking about in terms of the physiology and the behaviour has nicely been captured by the NIH working group report on weight loss maintenance. And they make the argument that weight loss affects appetite systems, it affects energy expenditure systems, both physiological and behavioural, and that creates difficulties in sustaining reductions in energy intake and in sustaining elevations of energy expenditure. And they make some suggestions on the mechanisms of action that might lead to more sustained maintenance of weight. The point I'd like to make to you today is that this quite beautiful model illustrates quite nicely how the field operates almost completely separately between energy balance and energy balance behaviours and behaviour change interventions. So this area of research here tends to be on a large scale, using cohorts, using behaviour change approaches. This tends to be on a small scale, using empirically very rigorous studies, and these two do not speak to each other. But the argument I'm making to you is that this stuff undermines this stuff. So our second position is we need to join those things up, that sustained weight management intervention should place greater emphasis on aligning the mechanisms of action of behaviour change interventions with the compensatory energy balance behaviours that undermine those interventions. We're not too far from the end, and I know it's the last presentation. There's a problem with that, and it is a problem of measurement. So we can measure weight real easy, and we can even track it real easy now. Measuring intake and measuring expenditure primarily relies on very expensive measurements you can only make infrequently, or it relies on self-report. And we know self-report measures are fundamentally flawed. So one of the things that we have been working on in NoHoW, which is showing tremendous promise, as per the recommendations of the Energy Balance Working Group report, which is we should be moving more towards objective free living measurements of energy expenditure and energy intake, is these things. And what we've been doing is people have been trying to do this for years, translate physical activity tracking devices into estimates of energy expenditure. And there's a number of reasons why we haven't got it right. One of the key reasons is we've been using linear models, and the relationships are very non-linear. Secondly, they're complex. Thirdly, these things don't collect enough data to continuously track until recently. Now they do. And that means we can continuously track minute-level data, send it to a cloud server, bring it back, and model those complex data. And the primary components of the models are heart rate, activity, and physical attributes of people. And if we use machine learning models, complex methods, we can produce numerous ensemble models to predict metabolic equivalents and test them out. And then we can validate them against, and we do not have time for the whole presentation on this today. I'll give you a quick snapshot. This is a Fitbit out-of-the-box estimate of energy expenditure. This is when we run the models validated against gold standards such as indirect calorimetry. We then take those models and we plug them in to the NIH intake balance models. So what this is a better free living measurement of energy expenditure. It's a work in progress. There are assumptions underlying it, but it shows great promise at the present time. If we plug that stuff in to the intake balance models, there's our measurement of physical activity, which we can translate through machine learning into energy expenditure. We can track body weight. If you know two components of the energy balance equation, you can resolve it for the third. Using validated mathematical models, there's actually two lots of models. There's the Pennington models and there's the NaH models. And the beauty of them is the assumptions are very clearly stated. You can actually download the models and play with them and play with the assumptions to see the errors that can be generated by the assumptions made. When you do that, you can estimate intake objectively over time. And in studies, longitudinal studies, behavior change studies, where you've got all these self-report, psychometric measurements predicting self-report, energy intake and energy expenditure, being able to do that is a wow, because it's putting an empirical measurement, which is objective, on two self-report predictors and outcomes. And this is actually what we're starting to do now. You take the NaH mathematical models to estimate changes in energy intake. These models use estimated change in physical activity energy expenditure. We plug in actual energy expenditure and it improves the models. And this gives us, perhaps for the first time in these kind of behavior change interventions, the potential for quantitative behavioral energy balance tracking. We can track people's body weight over the course of interventions. And we can then dissect how that body weight or change in energy storage is contributed to some extent on an individual level by changes in intake or changes in expenditure. So our third position in this area of research is that tracking compensatory changes in energy balance behaviors over time might actually help us improve prevention of weight regain and personalization of those interventions. And finally, if we go back to the psychological and behavioral predictors, I said pre-treatment stuff doesn't predict that much. It doesn't, because nothing has changed. The evidence points to self-management, self-regulatory components as being important and most promising for long-term maintenance. But it is the change in that stuff during the course of the intervention which is really important. And if you look at the literature, at the moment, there's an awful lot of literature here, pre-treatment predictors, and an awful lot of literature here, such as the National Weight Control Registry. If we want to understand how behaviour change interventions operate and function and to improve our understanding of how to make them work, we need to know what's going on here in the dynamic where weight swoops from loss to regain and find targeted interventions that will work at that point. And that means in the NaH weight loss maintenance framework, we want to look at moderators and mediators, sure, because this helps us with personalization. Who? This helps us with better intervention. How? And if we put quantitative energy balance frameworks on the bottom of it, it allows us to build an empirical framework where we can link those mechanisms to real quantitative outcomes, not just for the whole population that we're studying, but at the level of individual weight management. So our fourth and final position is that we need to think about how we're developing structured longitudinal assessments of moderators and mediators of energy balance behaviours, measured energy balance behaviours, and their relative contribution to weight outcomes in longer term weight management interventions. And that might take us from what someone has told me is a horrifically British view of a depressing scenario of dismal outcomes to something that perhaps is less British. So if you look at the challenges for weight loss maintenance, we can simply say, if we can engage a significant proportion of the population, evidence-based behavioural approaches, we will improve the situation. But the evidence is nowhere near as comprehensive as we might hope. If we can adapt behaviour change attempts to navigate around the physiological resistance to weight loss that undermines weight loss maintenance, we will be doing better. But we need to track energy balance behaviours to be able to do that. If we can provide behavioural solutions to facilitate coping with lapses, then people will do better themselves. Well, to do that, we will improve the situation dramatically with real-time assessments of what they're doing for actual energy balance behaviours. And if we can do all that, we can scale that stuff across the general population. But to really achieve that, we need to link those behavioural mechanisms of action with the actual objective measurements of the behaviours they are meant to influence. The challenges are individually considerable. One might suggest that they are collectively daunting, but I think we can actually dramatically improve the way we're going about behaviour change interventions for weight loss and maintenance by taking account of the dynamics of weight change during those interventions, and by bringing together research where we look at psychological and behavioural predictors together with measurement of how those outcomes actually happen. And I think that would be the next step in the next generation of weight management interventions that can be more personalisable. And we'd like to discuss any of these points that people would like to question or criticise, and we will circulate a new draft of the paper, which is already currently under amendment following the first round of feedback.
Any questions for James?
In my point of view, and maybe I've not understood it right enough, but you are going out for the energy balance equation, balances equaling intake versus expenditure. So what do you do with the homeostatic adaptations within the body that is reducing energy cost to all the physiological functions as reactions to weight loss, which are changing energy balance tremendously?
I don't think you can actually do anything about those things behaviourally, but you need to know what the size, what the scale of them is, so that you can adapt your behaviour change interventions accordingly. So if you reduce your energy intake by 1,500 calories and do not change behaviour at all, your weight will plateau.
Actually not. I disagree. That's the whole point. The whole point is that the measures we have of calorie need is actually, to a certain degree, wrong, because the body adapted.
Yes, the body does adapt, but energy requirements decrease, and that's why your body weight will plateau. You will decrease in metabolically active tissue mass, and if the deficit is quite severe, you will decrease energy expenditure per kilogram of metabolically active tissue mass, which is deemed metabolic adaptation.
You're not answering my question about the other physiological functions: growth, development, temperature, immunology, reproduction. Energy costs are reduced to these functions, impacting it hardly.
Well, this relates to adults, so we're not talking about growth and development. I don't think we're talking about reproduction, so we're assuming this is
reproduction, but yes.
We're assuming this is adults.
And children, adult, yes.
Yeah, not children and not pregnancy and lactation.
Children, yes.
But in this context, these interventions are all done in adults.
Yes, I know. But my point is just there's a physiological adaptation to weight loss.
Yes, there is.
That is altering the energy need tremendously.
But it reduces the energy need.
People need like 1,400 to lose weight. Studies actually show you should go down to 800 to maintain a weight loss.
Absolutely, I don't think we disagree. That's exactly what we're saying. So that, and what I'm saying is that behaviourally you cannot change that. That is a physiological inevitability. What you can do is design your behaviour change interventions to take account of it. So we heard about, in fact, the biggest loser is interesting for a number of reasons. The 500 calorie a day reduction in energy expenditure was physiology. It's a direct consequence of tissue loss and over and above tissue loss. So there's adaptation involved. It's one of the biggest recorded reductions in total daily energy expenditure outside of the Keys, Minnesota study. So your point is correct. The point I'm making back to you is that we cannot change that in terms of behaviour change interventions. So the behaviour change interventions need to be configured to navigate around it.
That's true. I totally agree.
Yeah.
We might modify them in the future with some medication, but you're right. Yeah.
So there are two components to energy expenditure: physiology, behaviour. Physiology has two components: obligatory, adaptive. And it's a key theme of this whole 2 days is complexity. And we are dealing with the complexity of obesities and the complexity of responses. And we need to have some complexity in the way we design and configure our interventions to deal with them.
So you said 75% is the food intake, but
Energy intake.
and 25% the energy expenditure, right? My question relates to something which I realize would not be easy to measure, but I'm wondering whether you can take some way into account in the analysis or so, because we know the energy expenditure is not only our exercise and resting metabolic energy expenditure, but we have subtle factors of the food-induced thermogenesis, our brown adipose tissue thermogenesis, the other non-exercise related thermogenesis, like for example, people who do fidgeting. We know
Energy cost of physical activities.
I realize it's not easy to measure at such a large scale, but is there some way you can account for that, or did you take it in your analysis?
You can account for it, and in fact, the NIH and the Pennington models do account for those factors by putting them in as adjustments, and they're extremely rigorous in the assumptions that they make. So if you trace your way back through the literature, they talk about the energy cost of weight gain, the energy into conversions involved in weight gain, the energy cost of tissue deposition, the energy cost of tissue synthesis, the diet-induced thermogenesis associated with it, and so on and so on. They actually cover most, if not all, known metabolic pathways in their assumptions. So we can take account of some of those factors. This level of analysis is quite crude, given the subtleties of some of those factors. So if energy balance and its components change in relation to over and under consumption, so you can then, as we all know, divide, for instance, energy expenditure into physiology and behavior. Then you can say adaptive, non-adaptive, physical activity, thermogenesis, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and so on. They're hard to measure in depth and in detail. If we can aggregate them, then it's useful in this context. But to really get to the nitty-gritty, then we still need to do those very detailed studies, which are longitudinal and very empirical. But those studies, I think, make the assumption, and I think it's probably not an unreasonable assumption, that many of these processes are quite reproducible across individuals. So thermogenesis, if you know the factors that predict it, is quite reproducible across individuals. The relationship between body composition, right down to the tissue level, and now the anthropometric scaling level, will give you over 90% of resting energy expenditure. Fat and fat-free mass will give you 75%. So the resolution is improving dramatically. I don't think we need that resolution for behavior change interventions, but we need to understand how all that stuff fits together and works.
That for those who lose weight and plateau, probably, this is the time where we should start pharmacotherapy in order for them not to regain weight.
Indeed, that's a very good argument, and we've deliberately not dealt with the issue of pharmacotherapy surgery in this context, because you guys are much more informed about treatment options, about which pathway to follow, and the nuances of those options in relation to a patient's specific circumstances. All this is talking about is that first line approach, which is usually put it together with pharmacotherapy. What we do know is that most people regain when they engage in a weight management intervention, and we're not very good at helping them deal with it. And where we want to move is to situations where we can target in a cost-effective way and in a personalised way interventions that help people better when they struggle, rather than just bring them into interventions. Because the one thing we do know is if they drop out and we lose them, that's the worst thing that can possibly happen.
What do you think about the patients that don't want to self-monitoring their behavior, and what do you recommend them? Because I think that tracking on energy balance behaviors, it has to be a part of the treatment of obesity, but we have many patients that they don't want to.
There is always going to be a problem with any aspect of offering a solution to patients. Some patients will refuse chemotherapy if they have cancer. Some patients will refuse pharmacotherapy if they have obesity. We're not saying that tracking energy balance behaviors is going to fix this. We're saying it's offering an empirical framework will work as a quantitative map that will help us stop using a whole bunch of psychometrics to predict a distant outcome called weight, and hope that we can somehow fill the gaps in by self-reporting between. For patients who don't want to engage in self-management or self-monitoring, I'm not sure whether you mean they personally don't want to engage or whether they don't want to be monitored. Then if they themselves don't want to self-monitor, one of the beauties of tracking devices is they can run automatically in the background. If they don't want to wear those devices, there's little we can do, and there's a need then to explore other options. We're putting a grant application together now, and I think if it is successful, one of the things that will come out of it, there is no ideal tracking device for this purpose at the moment, and one of the things that will come out of it will be a technical specification for an ideal device that captures 22 movement vectors, that captures heart rate, that streams it to cloud servers at a minute level. There is no device that does that at the moment. But it would not be difficult with current technology to actually produce such a device.
Thank you very much, James.